Oh man, do you ever record like 43 intros and just can't hit it, you know? Hey everybody, Joe Morrison, 49th State Angel Fund. Hope you're doing well. And I'm bringing you the second part of our North by North talk. So this is the second part of a two-part podcast. And this one features a lot of audience interaction. More on that, more on a cameo in a bit. First, some news. 3 pieces of news. Number 1. 49SAF, the 49th State Angel Fund, is intending to build 4 new partner funds. So that's what we're going to be spending our time doing over the next year or year plus. This stuff takes some time, but this is what we want to do. We want to partner with 4 new funds, and here they are. 1, it's the Alaska Seed Fund. So this fund is in its second year of operation, and it provides small amounts of capital, think $2,000 to $20,000, to entrepreneurs to help them prove something out. Maybe that's customer validation, a marketing study, getting toward a prototype. You know, this is really valuable stuff because it helps you sort of move your company forward and be eligible for funding streams further along. The second fund is an operating and amazing program run by the Anchorage Community Land Trust. It's called Set Up Shop. And this program graduates cohorts of diverse entrepreneurs and inclusive entrepreneurs that work in some of Anchorage's most diverse and unique and at times vulnerable neighborhoods. And it's a microfinance program. So I'm really excited about this because it opens our capital up to a wider audience and enables us to do more for more people in the Anchorage community. Microfinance, if you haven't read about it, it's small loans, sort of $5,000 to $35,000, structured as a loan program. And we're working through that with the wonderful folks at Anchorage Community Land Trust. The third fund, now this one is very venture-oriented. It will hopefully become the state's second startup accelerator. It's called Blue Pipeline. And so the idea here is that there's going to be an accelerator fund, which is a startup accelerator fund, sort of helps companies move through a process, makes them investable in about 12 weeks. And that is going to be based in Anchorage. That said, Blue Pipeline focuses on the maritime and mariculture technologies and intends to have a statewide footprint. Blue Pipeline's already operating efforts or will be shortly in the community of Seward. And, you know, thinking of the blue ocean economy, the blue ocean future, something that 49SAF's really excited about. Finally, the second fund from Anchorage businessmen John Rubini, Mark Kroloff, and Jimmy Miner. This is called the Anchorage Opportunity Fund. And we'll be working with them to develop their second fund, which will provide growth equity to eligible companies in Anchorage. So that's our job for the next year plus. It's a lot that we're putting on our plate, but we think it's going to add a lot of value to Anchorage. So what's the second piece of news? You know, the second piece of news is that we're starting to see some returns. We've had $1.6 million, a little more, in total returns from our investing efforts to date. And all of those returns have been sourced from the folks at the Anchorage Opportunity Fund. So we're very thankful for their hard work. We're appreciative, and we're taking some of this capital and recycling it into the community, continuing to pay for program expenses going forward. So those are the 2 big pieces of news. All right, let's get to the wonderful podcast we have planned for you. About 9 minutes in, I think this gets really interesting, where we start taking audience questions and we start hearing from entrepreneurs, university professionals, economic developers about what they can do to make Alaska's entrepreneurial ecosystem even better and how we can move forward and improve at being a framework that allows Alaska entrepreneurs to sort of launch into the market and get the support they need to the extent that we can help them. So there's a lot of diverse voices in this conversation, and I'm really excited for you to hear it. There's also a cameo somewhere in here from Jenny Marie Stryker. Listen to it. I really appreciate you guys. Thanks for listening to the 49SAF pod, and go Alaska. Cheers. So how do we get more investable deals? Basically, it's really tough to do what we do locally. And what's one thing we can do as a community to increase the odds of success, decrease failure rates? what is something we can do as a community to improve outcomes so that when we place capital, we're more likely to get it back? Because that's what's central to this discussion. Sort of if we 0x the remarkable wealth in this community when it starts to take risks, I agree with Eric. We do need results that we can point to say, yeah, that was a financial win and it was a community win. Cindy, how can we make our lives easier as fund managers so that we're taking less risk and comfortable placing our capital? What can we do?
Well, I think I go back to a very patient process, and that's the business education, the peer learning, creating the networks, replicating or blueprinting best practices. I think about the Otis sprints, which are a model of the Google Sprint adventures. But how can we replicate and transport these into rural Alaska or any other community, region, what that might look like? But more importantly, I think valuing the patient process to get there. And I know that I think as a sector, we are emerging. And oftentimes we don't recognize or give us that opportunity to say, this is a patient process, this is okay. And we work through as we mature in the sector. It's a difficult question. And I think my personal philosophy is just really taking that time and confessing that it is a patient process, but investing in the education, investing in the tools, allocating the time, and getting through that. I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's what it is for me.
I love that word patience. I was going to say to myself, and we need patient capital too, right? Or maybe we need more people who can't. I mean, you say, how do we take less risk? I mean, we may have to be willing to take more risk for a little while to try and get the broader ecosystem ready to where they are less risky. And that's maybe I just say that because that's where we sit, right? I mean, we work with these barely non-bankable, just barely non-bankable businesses, and so they're riskier clients typically. We keep coming back to education, but building networks. One of our programs, which you're familiar with, this business development competition called the Path to Prosperity. Over the years, we've seen a program like that attract stronger and stronger applicants. There's the applicant pool in year 5 looks so different than the applicant pool in year 1 because it does take time for some of these ideas to take hold. And one of the things I think that we do in that program that works really well for rural Alaska to help mitigate some of this risk, we talk about sustainability. Right, and thinking about how you're versus a business that's trying to make it go right or make it go now. We try to think about how can you be successful as a business and thrive in this place in perpetuity, right? And so if you're thinking about the impact that the community and the business will have on one another, the environment and the business will have on one another from the outset, and building metrics into your model to help you thrive there beyond just like getting to success, right? Staying at success. That's something that I think is critically important to our clients in rural Alaska, and I would argue to even these other startups who are looking to grow much bigger and much faster.
Well, I think one of the things as investors we can really start changing our mindset around is, we talk about tranches of investments, and there's this tranche that's at risk here, or this tranche has a better waterfall in the LLC agreement or in the investment agreement, but change the mindset. So it's not just about where your money is at risk in the cash flow, because cash is that comes later. First, I think the most important thing you can do as an investor to get comfortable with the risk you're taking on startups is to look at this as a partnership. And sometimes it starts off and you're dating and you might just be friends. And so it's not a really involved partnership, but you can do what we did with Eline Media is we got married. We have a merged management structure. We said, this is really risky. You guys are great at making video games, but you need someone with a finance background, you need someone with business background. We're inserting ourselves in your management team. Now, there's only so much capacity for that, but looking at an investment as a long-term relationship, whether it's passive or a mentorship type investment relationship or a long-term marriage is really important. And it can't just be about when that cash comes out. It's about taking that journey with that business or, helping them open doors to make that path grow faster and have longer-term success.
That's really interesting, Amy, and it sounds like it's a nurture approach, which is the opposite of the scalability approach, so that you're recognizing that it's really tough for Alaska to get to scale and that you're going to have to be deeply involved to improve those outcomes. I want to ask, so we're heading toward 4:30, but what I'd like to do is for the room to start thinking of questions. And I'm going to put together a white hat and black hat question for the panel. And this is about Alaska entrepreneurs. So there's a debate. It's out there. It's not here. I need one of the panelists to take the negative point of view. Debate about Alaska entrepreneurs. They're awesome. They're better than other entrepreneurs. They are just like every other entrepreneur in every state, and there's more commonality than we could ever think. They're not as good. They're not as sophisticated. They don't have the skill set to survive. And, I heard one criticism earlier today, which was that sometimes it can be hard to see outside Alaska. We're so disconnected. It's so difficult to get that view that's beyond us. So let's start with the negative. Who says that Alaska entrepreneurs aren't up to snuff? Who could make that argument? Anybody? Raise your hand. All right, we're going outside the circle to the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development, folks. Go ahead, folks, and introduce yourself.
Hey guys, I'm Nigel. So I know nothing about startups, but I'll tell you a little bit about entrepreneurs. So, Alaskan entrepreneurs, they live in their own little bubble up in the very top of the world. They're really not much more special than a lot of the other people out there. There are entrepreneurs around the world who are hungry to have some sort of action. I've lived in developing countries and I've seen entrepreneurs who have to figure things out, make things work and go forward. Alaskans have had a very comfy ride for 30, 40, 50 years potentially. They've did ask me to make this point, didn't you, Joe? So here I am.
I'll give you the opportunity to pull up.
Okay, right. And okay, good. And I think a lot of Alaskan entrepreneurs have come from sort of their parents and their generation have had a lot of sort of relative comforts. They're now approaching an economy with less certainty. They have the ability to just leave and go out to the lower 48 and make some more money if they want to, or go work on the slopes and make a ton of cash coming out of school without even a university degree and making a ton of cash. And therefore entrepreneurship for them is like, hey, how can I make some money so I can go skiing on the weekends, hunting fish during the summer and I don't know, taking photos of bears or whatever it is that Alaskans do. So something like that.
And let's recognize, like, this is a narrative, right? Like, this is the Alaska narrative. You hear it from investors on the side. So Nigel and/or Gretchen, what's the prescription? Recognizing that I asked Nigel to put this hat on. He may not actually think this way.
So the prescription, I think, is to give people an opportunity to go in and challenge one another on how can you what can we do locally, and actually how can we utilize our strengths as opposed to what are some of the deemed weaknesses? And the real prescription for success there is to let people know that they are playing on a global sort of competitive level and actually like open things up. So I think the prescription is to get out there and get exposed. I think sometimes we get very insular and we try and protect our entrepreneurs from exposure to outside ecosystems, and we don't want the harsh criticism. The word fragility got used a lot when I came into Alaska. Was like, well, no, this is a very fragile ecosystem, Nigel. You need to tone down your commentary a little bit. And I was like, why would I? Because in Silicon Valley, they wouldn't tone down their commentary, and neither would they on the East Coast. So we're sitting here, and there's an opportunity for us to be very direct and open and honest with our entrepreneurs. And I've seen each one of them sort of get, a soft slap in the face is much better from here in Alaska amongst friends than going down into the larger market and getting, a hard slap back into the ground where they have to go back and start again. So that's the prescription is work. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry if Gretchen wants to add something.
Yeah, this is Gretchen from Center for Economic Development. I was just going to double down on what Nigel said. It can be a hard lesson to learn when giving negative feedback, but something I really learned from Nigel is you can be direct, you can give the feedback, and if you approach it right, it helps people grow. Most often, I've seen it incredibly welcomed and beneficial. So thank you, Nigel, for introducing the real, authentic negative feedback to our conversation. But I say joking, but I also mean seriously, it's been really useful, I think, for helping people grow.
Right. I mean, so roses and thorns. And we're opening things up a little bit. As the audience starts thinking of questions, we'll take them. We're going here next. Juliet?
What comes to mind is, and it's not black and white, it's not polarized like that. I think it's fair to say that the odds are good in Alaska. Per capita, we have a pretty high output considering our population, but the goods are definitely odd. They're definitely odd and very nuanced. So, yes, important to keep in mind. And the last thing I'm going to say is I think there may even have been a tendency early on because of the desire to grow the Alaska investor network in the state, perhaps an inclination to resist supporting the idea of sending startups outside to compete for fear of losing them. So I think one of the necessary strategies is to broaden the vision, to be for our community to be willing to take more risks, for our entrepreneurs to be able to support them to take more risks on the outside, and for our investor community to grow and gain strength, to be able to receive them back. They are salmon. They go, they come back. We know this.
Hi, thank you, Joe. I'm Aurora Warrior with Alaska Growth Capital. Thank you, Joe. I'm going to play the devil's advocate a little bit. The negative traits of Alaska entrepreneurs, and this is just depending on who you are and how you define negative. For Alaskan entrepreneurs, I think entrepreneurs are community driven to a fault, to a T. Like naturally they align with the community. So for instance, I run a business plan competition on the North Slope, and working with community members, I was presented with someone who wanted to open up an auto repair shop, and I was like, great. And then I heard tell of another person who was interested, and then I started approaching them, and they were like, oh, the other person wants to? Oh, no, I won't do this, even though they already invested some of their resources into that. And the devotion to the community is great. That's fantastic. But if you're looking at on a competitive basis, then it could be a negative trait. But so it's a really good thing and a really bad thing for the entrepreneurs.
Thanks, Aurora. We'll come back here after that.
My name is Jeff Levin. One of the things I've been looking at specifically in the software development community is this idea that we are in a bubble. And when I say we're in a bubble, I mean we have people around the state who are stashed in cities that have huge wealths of information that are very specialized. And in this community, people don't believe there is a community because they don't have a chance to engage with those people. And I think that affects the entire entrepreneurial community because we're looking and seeing, oh, we don't have the resources to build a tech company, or we don't have the engineering specialty to make this happen. And really, I think there's another level of organizing people who are involved in specific trades and creating venues for them to get together and work on their craft. I think that's also something that's not being focused on.
Okay, I know we're headed over to Peter and then Penny.
Peter Webley, University of Alaska, and for the Twitter things, my handle is @pwebley, #NX. So the big thing for me is we've all spoken about education. I'm an academic, I work in a university. And I think to get more startup companies is we need to be going down levels in the education system. On talking to high school students, talking to groups in high schools and in university environments that focus on entrepreneurial information or entrepreneurial or innovation groups, because they're the ones that will start up the new companies or think of the idea that could lead to the startup company. So in a couple of years, you may have 10 or 15 companies spinning out of a group of students or a university, and then you'll have 5 or 6 companies coming to launch Alaska. So I think in terms of education, it can be educating the entrepreneurs that are outside the school system, but if we can educate people inside the school system to become entrepreneurs, then they'll be the next generation of startup companies that will just be forming themselves without having to be told or being informed, this is how you start a company. They'll be doing it because they'll have learned it at 14, 15, 16, 18, 21.
And I think here I'm going to take a side note before I go to Penny, in that this is happening in our community and we don't really know about it. There's a gentleman named Andy Rogers, and he was one of the founders of Pango Media. He has taken over Alaska Business Week, and that is the high school and younger conversation about building your own business. So for this group, if you can lend him any support, please try to, and I'll try and have him on the podcast. But now to Penny Gage with the state.
My name is Penny. I work for the State Division of Economic Development. And so I'm looking at this panel of investors and startups, and I'm an economic developer, and trying to see where we fit in this space. And that's something that I speak a lot about with folks in the room. And I think Nigel's message of stopping the coddling is something that we're really trying to do. You know, Eric speaks about he participated in these business plan competitions, these forums, these conferences that the economic development community and others have really built up. But we're hoping to step back. You know, we're hoping that that entrepreneurs, that folks who have started these startups, really take the reins, because that's what happens in other states. That's what the trend is, and that's really who usually leads in these. And so that's just something I'm critically thinking about throughout this conference and this panel is. I know that entrepreneurs are so busy; they're not really getting normal paychecks. How to increase the responsibility that they have, while not overwhelming them, but really challenging them to step up and then take some of these roles that folks like me hold in the community, but really need to be passing the torch off.
Okay, let's go over here. Hi.
Hi, I'm Jake Carpenter from Juneau. And I did want to speak to the feedstock of entrepreneurs in Alaska, because I think a lot of us have had the opportunity to travel all over the state, and I think that the feedstock is special. We have people who have lived here for 10 or 20 millennia who have survived in the harshest environment that there is and have thrived in that environment. And then we have the people that selected to come here and journey to Alaska with the direct intention of living in the last frontier and leading a harder life and understanding everything that comes with it. So I don't think that there's any lack of grit, and I don't think that anybody needs to be coddled. But I think what is important is that entrepreneurship in and of itself is a language. There's a specific way of talking, a specific way of living, and a specific way of interacting, which is not standard, I think, to any culture. And because it's a network effect, we need to nurture at the very lowest level the people, the skills, and teach the language, teach the vernacular, and not worry about outcomes at the business plan competition level, at anything like that. Mostly teach the language so that people can create the businesses, because if there's enough good ideas and enough good entrepreneurs, there will be enough good investors. Investment funds are probably the only thing less successful than startups when it comes to outcomes, right? So they fail at a pretty high rate. So really, I think the focus for state regulators and for education and for other startups through employment or whatever, or beacons, is to teach the language and not really worry because we have the best feedstock.
So we heard the positive side of entrepreneurs. Was that a hand, Eric? Yeah. Okay, no, we're coming to you. So that was the positive side of Alaska entrepreneurs. And there are many investors who say, the criticism, if there is criticism, and I think we heard a stereotypical criticism of Alaskan entrepreneurs earlier, that criticism is somewhat convenient. And maybe it's convenient because of we're a little, Paul said earlier, maybe we need to take more risk. Maybe we're a little risk averse. Maybe we're just not sure we can do it here. But there are plenty of investors in our community who say, I kind of see the same risk levels and the same skill sets inside and outside Alaska. Eric.
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of these conversations in the past, and there's always this tendency for the entrepreneurs to talk about what the investors could be doing better and differently, and the investors to talk about what the entrepreneurs could be doing better and differently. And this has been a lot more like even than often, I think, so that's good. I really liked what people are saying, though. In my opinion, I think the responsibility for this is 90% on the shoulders of the entrepreneurs. Like, it's on us to build something successful. Raising capital is useful and necessary in many cases, but not being coddled, I think that is probably like one of the best things that can be done in our ecosystem. Penny spoke about the different competitions and so on, which were super useful for our company in particular, because it gave us a little capital. It gave us like that validation. And then afterwards, it was like we started really figuring out where the real business is, where the real customers are, where the value is that we're actually going to be delivering to them. The original idea to help public speakers was not a good business model, but the learning that we went through in those competitions was super valuable. But I totally agree. Like, I think the entrepreneurial community should be doing that. About asking me what can someone who's not necessarily directly investing in your company do? Opening up the network. Like, I would never expect somebody to just open up their network for me, but if somebody wants to help, that is so useful. I mean, we have any number of different customer personas or types of people that we need to be talking to, particularly outside of Alaska. And yeah, I'm always just shocked at how big other people's networks are and how useful that can be and how much value can be created, like on a two-way street. Penny, this is not exactly a competition, but we are talking to a number of investors in Fairbanks right now. We're putting on some luncheons. I think the plan is to have them like a monthly luncheon where a couple of startups pitch a group of Fairbanks investors. And I think they're interested in having some Anchorage investors as well, but I'm not going to make that claim without speaking to them directly. But it's open to any Alaskan startups. So this is something that I think anybody who's trying to raise some capital is welcome to apply and try to come pitch up there a little bit to build that part of the ecosystem also.
I came up to Alaska about 18 years ago now and would never leave. Since I've been working up here, I think per capita of population up here, there's probably more family companies, family-run businesses here than any other place I've ever been. So in my mind, I think this is probably the most entrepreneurial place I've ever been. There's a distinction between having really serious competition elsewhere and being somewhat perhaps insulated here from it until you go into a global environment versus the entrepreneurial spirit, which I think is really strong here. I mean, more businesses here per population, I think, are run by families and people than by large corporations. Just a thought.
So before we call it, and I'll give Nigel the mic, and then John, I'd like sort of your thoughts as an external observer, and then we'll go to the final word. And the final word's a word from each of our panelists on, is this a movement? If so, explain it, because I can't. And what's your wish? Okay, so is this a movement? If so, what is that movement? And what's your wish for it? But Nigel, you wanted to say something, and then we'll give John his perspective.
Thank you, Joe. Just a comment, and this comment's really for the entrepreneurs, because here in the US, I think there's a tendency to say that, we're very accepting of failure, and we're very sort of agreeing with that. And I just want to say, I don't think failure is okay. I think failure is not okay. I think people should stop frigging failing and not learning anything from it, because I think every entrepreneur absolutely deserves the right to fail in front of their investors. But I almost feel that publicly we need to be able to get up and be able to put in our top 3 lessons learned of why we failed, right? We never hit customer value, we never, or we couldn't raise money and that's why, or because we didn't have a big enough ecosystem to support us, or the market was just not really there when we arrived at the market, isn't real learnings. And I think there's a lot going on in this community where, interestingly, I think it comes from that historical piece, which Jake, I think you spoke to, that resilience of sort of this Alaskan of you have to be very hardy to be in Alaska, and therefore you either survive the Alaskan winters and you stay here, or you kind of fail and go away. And we kind of look at the people that kind of failed as being people that sort of drift off in the distance. But entrepreneurship isn't like that. Entrepreneurship is incredibly hard. It's harder than surviving an Alaskan winter. You've got a much better chance of getting through a winter in Anchorage than you do of making a successful startup happen. And therefore we need to be a bit more sort of supportive in that case, and at the same time, the entrepreneurs need to stop going I kind of failed and did this thing, and they creep back into the corners, and instead we get re-inclusive, we re-engage them back into the community, and there is one ticket for entry to get re-engaged in the community, and that is that you share your failures, you share your learnings that you've had through that. So just a comment for the entrepreneurs.
I think I just want to follow on to failure briefly. There's a balance there somewhere. And I agree with your points. And when I'm working with companies, or when I have worked with companies, my attitude has been, look, I'm a little tough, but the market's going to be tougher on you than I ever will, right? And then at the same time, when we started the 49th State Angel Fund 6 years ago, I think we've had 3 or 4 volunteer advisors. One of the first ones was Steve Mersell. And he said, at the same time, it's not, if you sign your name to something and it fails, that's your name. True. But from an ecosystem and from a portfolio point of view, especially from a portfolio point of view, we have to accept that there will be failure. And that in order to have success, in order to have that lighthouse, we're going to see the failures first. That's the only comment I want to make and acknowledge.
So when I was the economic development director of Corvallis, a town that had lost its angel network, it didn't have any investments happening, it didn't have any startups that were visible. I went to Portland and I looked at all of the different pieces, and then I went to Seattle and I looked at all the pieces, and I stole the ones that were interesting and brought them back home. And so Open Coffee, Startup Weekend, and so forth. When I go to Norway and do the first Startup Weekend there, I noticed that in the room, almost 30-40% of the people had been to San Francisco. And so the Norwegian government was actually making it possible for them to be outside their box. And so they were speaking the language of San Francisco because they'd been there and they met people and they'd engaged and been forward. So the core of this question that you're asking is a narrative question of how the story is told. We can't do that because it's not possible, because we're not succeeding, because are all language that I was hearing. But that's not the story you want. So are you wanting to have a discussion about time in the past or time in the present where we can't? Or are you wanting to have a conversation about we can and will and do and tell that story? The role of the economic department is not to step back and let entrepreneurs do it. It's to step forward and create the space where the entrepreneurs can have a voice, where the investors can have a voice, because neither of them have the time or resources or actually the skills to create the facilitation of the conversation, nor the ability to frame the narrative about where we will be. When you do your startup, you have a lovely hypothetical curve, right? And everybody says it's lying. I'm giving you this lying. We know it's wrong. We're lying. But it's not true that you're lying. It just hasn't been executed on yet. And if you are the entrepreneur, you have to believe and see how executing on that dotted line to get that exponential thing is possible. And then you have to believe it in your guts so much that you actually make it happen. That's the narrative that you are not telling in the room today. So what's the thing you want? How do you tell the story of what you want? How does everybody hold hands to make it go? It's not necessary for everybody to be the one hero to make it go. It's possible for groups of people to tell a story and travel together and make it happen. Started with Norway 7 years ago, and now they've had, 150 startup weekends. They now have dozens of startup conferences, angel conferences like mine, going there because a few people held hands and said, this is the way the world will be. So what's your narrative about what the world will be in Alaska?
Think of this room as a community, and this is the community that has been built. The final word from our panel. What's your wish in 2018 for this community? Okay?
Can I answer, is this a movement? Because you asked that question earlier.
So it was kind of brainy, it's a little on the brainy side, but you can do whatever you want, Paul.
No, I think I think it is a movement. Earlier today at the luncheon, there were conflicting reports, right? I'll look around at the landscape from this angel network, and it's disappointing to see where we sit in Alaska. But then if you look backwards, it's so exciting to see where we've come since the last North by Northwest, and we've got all these. We've got some stories, right? That's movement. Do we need more soft slaps in the face from Nigel, or do we need more coddling and nurturing from the Amy's and the Cindy's and the Pauls? We probably need both, and some entrepreneurs may need some of both at the same time. But over time, they'll need less coddling and more soft slaps in the face, and then eventually maybe a hard slap in the face from somebody else, right? That right there is movement in those entrepreneurs' capacity in their growth. So I think absolutely it's a movement. It's a movement towards entrepreneurship, and I think we're getting there, even if we don't have the same vocabulary and we haven't advanced as a good culture right here as far as Boulder has, but it's happening, and I think it's happening fast. And one thing that I think is really exciting about what we can see is that for as big as Alaska is, it's still pretty accessible. Everybody in this room nodded their heads when we talked about it Tentley, and they nodded their heads when we talked about Barnacle. So those are, I think Eric hit the nail on the head a couple times. It's on the entrepreneurs to make this go ultimately. And he said something else really great too, but I forgot what it is. But it is happening, and I think that network of entrepreneurs and being as accessible, and that's not to say they're not busy, but we can still point to each other and seeing that big win, right? So if it's a Tentley, if it's Barnacle, if it's a Malga, if it's Bambino's, here's a generation or a micro generation of entrepreneurial wins. And pretty soon they'll get bigger and we'll have more of them and we'll be able to keep pointing to them. And, if everybody in this room knows who they are now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there'll be so many that we're all learning about these really new, awesome companies that have started. And that, so yeah, maybe it's early, but it's definitely a movement. And I think you'd be hard pressed to argue that it's not.
Hardly to follow, Paul. I would agree that yes, it's a movement, and I would also say that I think it's an immersion, and that it's happening both from the entrepreneurial community and even the investor sector. I had recently transferred from community lending, and I brought that philosophy, if you will, to the work I do today, managing. It's a hybrid venture capital equity investing fund. But I went through the exercise of utilizing the J curve, and that I can relate to that exercise. But a great mentor reminded me that performance is going to come from the unexpected and the unusual, and to keep working that as well. And I think about that, and I just kind of keep going back to that word patience and nurturing. And what I take away from this is if we could continue to have these conversations and more place-based as well. Can we take these conversations to rural Alaska? Can we bring more diversity into these circles and continue the dialogue and inquire and probe even more so that we can be responsive investors as well?
Well, I really want this to be a movement. And I agree there's the beginnings of a movement, but there's so much naysaying out there. And, I think one of the things I didn't hear, which I should have raised my hand on, was that one of the first things I hear when they hear a nonprofit is going in and making investments. They're like, well, why would you make investments locally? All the good deals are taken. And that drives me absolutely nuts. And so what I really hope for the future is that we harness the ideas out there. We recently brought up a team of people to do what we call a world build. And we spent time with youth and elders and business leaders and community leaders in Anchorage. And then we took them up to Upyavik to do the same thing. And we played this game called The Thing from the Future. And it is a game that's designed to ask questions like, in an innovative future, there's a medicine about mental health. What is it? And it puts the kids, it puts the elders in a place that it nods to the barriers in front of them, but lets them dream about the future. And the ideas they came up with were amazing. Tattoos that, can show when the diabetic blood levels are off and they need to be worried. How you use drones, how you can modify and take the idea of snow goggles and do a GPS version to see the thickness of the ice. And these all have international reach. So there are ideas out there, but we aren't giving them the avenues to talk about them. And for anyone who wants to learn about the thing from the future, I'm getting 500 free decks sent up to Alaska. I'm going to be hosting a training. I'd be happy to invite you guys to the training.
So I oftentimes in Juneau am told that it feels like this movement that happened about 30 some odd years ago when Juneau had a boom and now they're more successful businesses. So we had Heritage Coffee, Taku Smokeries, Gas Snow Guiding, and Alaskan Brewing Company all blow up all at once. And people have kind of compared this nest of businesses that are starting up in Juneau right now to that happening. And I'm excited to be a part of it. And something that's been amazing is that we've all been really close. And I think it kind of started with a company called Tidal Vision. They were making fish skin wallets, and it's a cool thing, but I don't think people realize that Craig Caseberg's vision, he's now making these mind-blowing fabrics from crab shells. It's incredible. When, earlier I mentioned value added to fisheries. He's using parts of from fisheries that were originally a waste, and the amount of vision and information that he passed down to the businesses now in Juneau and the community that we formed, it does feel like a movement, and we have these great resources and this great exchange of resources that then is magnified by groups and people like Paul, Brian over there from Juneau Economic Development Council, these resources that set us up with these networking opportunities that then inspire new entrepreneurs like myself beyond just Juneau. So, at Tentley, I remember seeing about you guys or learning about you guys 2 years ago, and earlier today, I forget your partner's name, Ben, one that isn't an Eric, and I was so excited. I sat there and threw questions at him for like half an hour because I've seen us become each other's great support, biggest cheerleaders, because I would love to see a Tentley go huge on the national scale. And then in my hometown, I have this resource of Jeff and Marcy Larson, the owners of Alaskan Brewing Company, have been so generous with their knowledge. And, at a time when you just see a brewery like Ballast Point sell for $1 billion, and Alaskan Brewing Company is just as large, if not larger than them, the potential is there. So there are some wins out there. And I think that we're seeing kind of this upwelling of new wins. And I think that the thing that makes it really powerful is the networking that we're connected to, the people like Nigel who come to our state and slap us around a little bit, push us harder, tell us to go harder. All of these things are really, really exciting. And I'm so happy that my small, humble business has the potential to be one of those wins, and that I've got this great community to lean on.
So, whatever. We're in a time of great change, and we're starting to see cracks in that. One of the things that you have here is a 10% unemployment rate because the cracks are happening. The thing that will fill those cracks is the entrepreneurs, and this conversation is not a side conversation to the future. It is the future conversation. And so the cracks will be filled with the entrepreneurs and the investors that are doing this very important work. And even though it's a very small 1 to 2% of the population that does this, it's the thing that allows for things to happen that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And this prevents the Detroit experience or the Pittsburgh experience when you plant these seeds now early when the cracks are small.
Well, I guess I'll say something tactical because everything here is wonderful and very true. And to your point, when things are really bad in an economy, that's when you see a whole lot of entrepreneurs come to the forefront, if only to survive. It's an important thing to do. But tactically, if we're going to be world-class entrepreneurial community, we need to eliminate the barriers to being world-class entrepreneurs. And so a question for all of us, mostly us panelists, how do we eliminate the impediments to being a successful entrepreneur here? And right down to where do you go to find out the 14 things that you really should do and figure out and do well if you're going to be successful? It's very hard to figure that out, as you said earlier. It's hard to know what do you do next and where do you go. So we can work on that.
So I've got to be on stage at 5. So I just had one thing to say. Is it a movement? I don't really know. I think the distinction between is it a movement or not is not actually that important. What matters more is 2 things. Are we going in the right direction, and should we be moving faster? And I think the answer to both is unequivocally yes. So thank you.
I think our movement is a process of evolution. Like we're evolving, we're growing. The point is, as we're evolving, that we share the information that we've learned with others, and especially with the younger generation going back to elementary schools. We do outreach actually for our business, either from the health nutrition aspect or from the business, is nurturing and at the beginning, cuddling, the nurturing business environment for those younger generations, but for us as adults, as we grow and build our businesses, that we continue to share that information and keep pushing us to every limit to learn and excel from one another.
Ben, do you want a word? You sure? You can have a word.
Sure. Hi. So I've heard a lot of people, I'm actually completely outside of the business thing. I come much more from tech. But a lot of what I hear is sort of a resistance to starting businesses that is, I don't know what it comes from, but it feels like everyone's talking about, people need to take more risks. But I feel like we need to communicate that there's actually, we're systematically overestimating the risk. That Alaska is actually unique in that people come here because they love it, and they come here and they're smart when they come here. There's lots of resources that we have available to us. And So both entrepreneurs and investors, I think, overestimate the risk that is actually here in Alaska, and I feel like that's because of historical reasons, essentially, because we used to be isolated, like literally isolated, and that's becoming less and less true by the day. That was everything I had to say.
But I think that's an awesome, positive note to end on. So please give Ben a round of applause. And please give our panelists introduce our 8 panelists. A round of applause. We want one more. And you can tell by my voice, this is it. We are closing the podcast. I'm going to hand things off. I want to say thank you to all our wonderful panelists. Handing things off to the great Jenny Marie Stryker, who has been an awesome coworker for so many months. Jenny, take us out.
Thank you. I don't think there's much more to say, but I just want to say thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all of you for showing up, for listening, for going with Joe's crazy punches. Thank you, Nigel, for playing along. And everybody, a round of applause and enjoy the rest of North by North.